see you guys in the dark.
I have no idea how we got home. To this day, it defies logic. I have asked the people that were with me. They had not even given it a second thought. Pretty bizarre. I wouldn't consider them to be the type of people to ignore crucial details. But then again, neither am I, and I never even thought to bring it up. Not the next day, not the remainder of our trip, not in the years that followed. Not until one night at a casual dinner that we had together some 7 years later. They were just bewildered as I was. Both of them sat in silence for a moment, bug-eyed and caught deep in thought. How the fuck did we get home? I could feel a slight smile tugging slightly at one corner of my mouth as I said it. I knew the answer already. I had pondered it for months. I don't know, they both said in unison. We all sat in silence, unsure how to continue the conversation. I suppose that I should start at the beginning. The listing of characters and whatnot. What we were doing, why we were there. Set the scene, I suppose. The couple I was having dinner with are Ben and Stacy, longtime good friends. They're good people. Ben and I had shared a mutual interest in JDM drift cars in the early 20s, and I had met his partner Stacy not long after he and I met. In 2005, my girlfriend Tegan and I had been invited to go to England to visit my stepfather, and I had offered for Ben and Stacy to join. They eagerly accepted and saved up the money to come along. I have always held a fascination for old, creepy, or abandoned properties or houses, and was extremely excited to explore England to see what the country had to offer. Stacy shared my interest in such places, and had expressed her interest in accompanying me should I find anything. Ben and Tegan were not as keen on the idea, but seemed happy to tag along if anything were to eventuate from this. A few days into our trip, I was able to find that there were an old hospital that had been abandoned since the 1980s, but it was soon to be repurposed into a mental health clinic. The hospital in question was around a 2 to 3 hour drive away into a rural English countryside. We rented a car, and I spent the best part of an hour explaining to Tegan that if she was going to chicken out on us, it was best that she stayed behind. She insisted that she possessed the testicular fortitude to join us, and I believed her. The rental was not cheap, as we were all under the age of 25, which meant that the premium remained in the cost of the rental. Regardless, we split the rental costs between all four of us, and we asked my stepfather's partner to drop us off to collect the car from the rental hub. We picked up the car, an absolute piece of shit manual Fiat 500, as it was the cheapest. The rear seats had literally 0% padding for Stacy and Tegan, who had to sit in the back as I was the driver, and Ben towered over all of us. We set off driving and using an outdated road map that my stepfather had lent us. The Navman option had been out for our price range, and let me tell you, I will never again complain about NSW road posting after they tried to navigate around England countryside. The road map was of minimal help, as it was so ancient that 3 of the turnoffs that were clearly displayed on it yellowed. Weathered pages no longer even existed. Twice Ben had informed me of an upcoming T intersection that never arrived, and yet we seemed to seamlessly enter into the route that we had planned out regardless. We stopped at KFC, which was a massive culture shock to all of us. No potato and gravy? Baked beans instead? Thank God our ancestors had committed crimes that had them sent to Australia back in the day. Tegan and Stacy were mumbling about the lack of padding on the back seat, which Ben and I brushed off as unnecessary whining. We finished up lunch and set off on the road again. The days are short in England. The sunlight disappears much quicker than back home. I was not particularly bothered, as I just thought that it would simply add to the dark atmosphere when we eventually arrived. We arrived in the general vicinity of the hospital about 2 hours of driving, and we said to hell with the road map, as it was more trouble than it was worth. We saw some old signposts on bent poles that indicated that we were heading in the right direction, and decided to follow them. It took us through a rabbit warren of back roads and dirt tracks, doing U-turns and a lot of swearing until we came across the ruins of a castle-esque type of house that had obviously been gutted out from a fire some years ago. I decided to stop there to stretch our legs and get some photos. The ruins of this place were amazing. I managed to get some great pictures, although I was only starting out as a photographer. And so they were just grainy at best. We loitered around for about 45 minutes before deciding to give the hospital one more crack. We piled into the car and white-knuckled the reading of the road map. Ben and I decided on a likely route before I started the car, and we set off. We actually managed to find the hospital this time. Ben had chosen the route well, and I rolled up to the toll booth that was located on the road just outside of the hospital grounds. I could see the building in the distance, and the plant equipment sectioned off nearby in order to begin demolition or renovations. The security guard at the toll booth did not seem to be pleased to see us, and was very dismissive. I imagined that he would turn people away all the time for the very same reason that we were trying to gain entry. I was determined not to give up, though. After I did a 3-point turn to get out of the small section of road, I rounded the corner in order to circumvent the patrolled area, and entered an estate at the rear entrance of the hospital. Parking the car, I could see that the hospital lay just beyond the open field nearby. The sky was pitch black by now. The only lighting was coming from a dimly lit street lamp that flickered on and off every few seconds. When I opened the door, I noticed that the air was incredibly cold, and the street was eerily silent. Stacy and I practically leapt out of the car in anticipation of getting to the hospital, while Ben and Tegan reluctantly opened their respective doors to get out. We all zipped up our jackets and put our scarves on while trudging to the field. The ground was so wet and muddy that we had to use torches on our phones to prevent ourselves from sinking our feet into the deep puddles. Clearly, this field had been recently used to move the plant equipment to the area, and as a result, much of the terrain was torn up with deep turrets from machine tracks. Stacy and I took the lead while Ben and Tegan lagged behind. I did not think much into it. I knew that they were not into this stuff. We walked for about 2 minutes before I heard Ben call out to us. Stacy and I stopped and turned around. "What?" I said as I stood still, a light breeze beginning to blow now. "Tegan doesn't want to go," Ben said in an apologetic tone. I looked at Tegan. Her head was now bowed down towards the ground, and her arms were crossed tightly over her chest. We all stood there for a moment, and I sighed loudly. "Okay, let's go back to the car," Stacy and I were not happy, but we knew that leaving Tegan at the car was not an option, and we wanted everybody to come with us. Stacy let out an audible, "Damn it," and we began the painstaking journey back to the little Fiat. When we got back to the car, we all silently got back in and took a moment to make our clothing a little more comfortable for travel. This is where the story gets a little strange. Not much was said between any of us. I started the car and began to drive. We did not discuss a route home, and I had no clue where we were. I just started driving. I found a dirt road and took that. Nobody in the car said a word about this. I noticed a sign haphazardly nailed crookedly to a gnarly-looking tree that said London 40 miles, that somebody had obviously painted and made it home. I continued to drive. I remembered nothing about that road. I don't recall anything until I was at a large intersection back in London. I looked around the car. All of us wore stoic expressions and seemed rather listless. Then another skip, like a damaged VHS tape. We were at a Chinese restaurant near to where my stepfather lived. We were all sitting around a square table with a cheap blue tablecloth. All of a sudden, all 4 of our forks slid off the table and onto the floor. Stacy and I were opposite each other when this had happened, and we glanced at each other with perplexed expressions before bending down to retrieve our forks together. Stacy looked at me again and said that was weird. She sounded far off and distant, as though she was talking underwater. "What?" I asked her, straining my ears to hear her just as her volume and cadence returned back to normal. "That was weird," she said, clear as day. The bustling noises of a busy restaurant also now returning to fill the void of ambient background noise that I had not even noticed was missing up until that point. Skip again, getting into bed and feeling extremely heavy and sedated. We all woke up the next day and seemed perfectly normal. We ate breakfast together while Ben and I cracked bad jokes off at each other, as we always did. We returned the car later that day, after I checked the back seats after the fuss the girls had made, and yes, they were indeed devoid of any padding, and never spoke of the outing again. Not once, losing hours of time with friends that can verify they experienced the same thing. A subconscious refusal to dwell on it, or even bring it up. What the fuck actually happened to that night? I was approximately 4 to 5 years of age, and living in with my mom and younger brother, Seamus, in a small 3-bedroom house in Otago. The house was small and run down, thin isolation and made of cheap weatherboard. As the older and somewhat more hyperactive brother, I did not conform to normal sleeping patterns. It would quite often wake up at all hours of the night, including the very early morning. Of course, I decided that I would need to include my brother, Seamus, in any shenanigans that I would be up to. But this night was different. Instead of including him in activities, I in fact excluded him in the worst possible way. It was a typical cold South Island night, and there was already frost etched on every glass surface on the outside of the house. New Zealand often gets into the minus degrees, and this night was no exception. I woke as usual past midnight, and immediately crawled out of bed and opened the bedroom door. Seamus's room was directly across from mine, and I made my way into his room easily as he slept with the door open. "Seamus," I whispered. "Seamus," I called a little bit louder this time, reaching out to rock his shoulder gently. He grunted quietly before slowly rolling over to look at me. "What?" he asked sleepily, yawning as he did so, rubbing his eyes lazily. "Want to go on an adventure?" I said. I'll never forget how quickly his eyes lit up. "Yeah," he practically jumped out of bed. We snuck down the hall, past our mother's room, and turned right into the kitchen, where we continued through the back door. "You first," I said, as I opened the door for him. Seamus stepped outside without hesitation. I then slammed the door shut, locking it, covering my mouth to stifle the fit of laughter that was attempting to escape from my throat. The door had no glass that I was able to peer out of, as I was under 4 foot tall. As I tilted my head upwards, I could see a small rectangular pane of grimy, unwashed glass, though. It was out of reach to me, however, and so chose to ignore it. I stood there, and hand flat against the hard wood, waiting for Seamus to begin pounding on the door at any second. This was a prank that I played on him fairly regularly, and he always reacted in the same manner, which was sheer, no-holds-bar panic. But no sound. Nothing. I waited and waited. Still nothing. No knocks, no cries. I carefully retrieved a chair from the dining room table and rammed it up against the door before scrambling up in order to peer through the glass pane. I could see nothing except for our backyard. I got down off of the chair and moved it out of the way before turning the large bronze knob of the deadbolt mechanism. I gingerly unlocked the door, opened it slowly to prevent the hinges from squealing too loudly, and peered outside. Nothing. Just darkness and chilled wind. Panicky, I shut the door and opened it again, hoping that would help, but it did not achieve anything. I closed the door, confused. I thought that he had perhaps caught onto my trick and had ran to the front door of the house. I made my way there swiftly, unlocking it and throwing it open. Once again, just a dark void. My imagination was running wild, and I thought that I could hear the faint cry of my name being repeated on the light breeze. As a 5-year-old, I didn't have any grasp on the seriousness of the situation. I did not want to wake my mom up at this time of night to explain what had happened to her. So I just went to bed. Seamus was back in his bed in the morning, and nothing was said. He seemed a little odd, though. My mom even picked up on it. He was back to his usual self after a few days, however, and our lives returned to normal. I never pranked him in such a manner ever again. Years later, while we were sharing a bottle of whiskey, I brought the situation up with him and inquired as to what happened to him that night. His face suddenly became stern and pale. "I was hoping you had forgotten about that," he said under his breath. He took another swig of whiskey and sighed before delving into his side of what had happened that night. Seamus, to this day, has fleeting images of the door shutting and opened rapidly for about 2 minutes with nobody being the cause. He remembers screaming and shouting for help and banging on every house surface and window for a full 15 minutes, always feeling like he was being watched, catching glimpses of a tall, dark figure standing near him. The cold was dreadful, and it seemed to literally seep into his bones. The silence for him was only ever broken by a sharp wheeze of breath or a snarl that seemed to be right next to his ear. I then asked him how did he get back inside. He looked at me and said, I fell from the ceiling of our house into our lounge room. It was like a nightmare.
If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell for notifications on future videos and become a stalker of the night. And I'll see you next time.